So to get started, this is just a reminder of what the concept of flow is all about. And we have the definition of flow from MC here. He says, flow is the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at great cost. Flow is when you're so invested in a project that you lose track of time, you lose track of self, action and awareness feel like they merge. And there's also this important concept of flow that we keep talking about again and again, the challenge skills balance. Flow happens when your skills meet the challenge at hand. So you're in what we often call the sweet spot of the flow channel, where you're avoiding boredom on the one hand, that would be if your skills are greater than the challenge, and avoiding anxiety on the other hand, which would be if the challenge exceeded your skill. So flow is that sweet spot channel that we're all trying to get into. And it's the state where people feel their best and perform their best. So it's something that I think we all aspire to try to be in as much as we can, so that we can do our best in the world and experience deep levels of happiness. All right, ready to get into chapter 2 here. So chapter 2 is called Who Controls the Mind? And he splits it up into several different sections. The first section is a point that he calls eternal dissatisfaction. And he's talking about even how throughout history, we see all the ways in which people are dissatisfied. The main point here is to develop selves capable of dealing with the evolutionary forces rushing us into the third millennium, because he was writing this at the end of the 90s. It is imperative to become better acquainted with the functioning of the mind. The more we learn about how the mind works, the more we realize that the filter through which we experience the world has some built-in biases. Seeking to understand how these biases work is the key to getting our thoughts and actions under our conscious control. And so, of course, one of our biases is, for example, a kind of negative bias. It's kind of been something that's been demonstrated that human beings, we focus more on things that go bad rather than things that go well. It's that popular phrase we always hear about the news, that if it bleeds, it leads, that the way that people are interested in car crashes on the road, that these are the kinds of things that capture our attention. And perhaps it makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint that if we didn't pay attention to these things that are threats, that it would perhaps impede our survival. But then it also leads to a state of dissatisfaction. Do you want to say anything about this part of the chapter, Maritza?
The thing here that I thought stood out for this chapter was the idea that, and we'll see this throughout the entire chapter, honestly, is the idea of just because we have a potential pre-programmed like emotion, feeling, or happenstance, we don't have to just float along and accept it. This this section, when I first was reading this, it made me think of Dylan Thomas's Rage Against the Dying Night, that poem, just because I really think that that's this whole chapter, that's kind of what it's telling us. Sure, we have a predisposition. Evolutionary traits are fierce, and we're still working through that. But the idea of being aware, that's the way to find a path around these biases. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah. Just one more point I'll make about this part of the chapter 2, this idea of eternal dissatisfaction. He's also talking about the idea that nowadays often gets referred to as hedonic adaptation, this idea that we're constantly wanting more. So the idea that people sometimes think like, oh, if I had this new car, this new job, this vacation, this new house, then I would finally be happy. But you reach those things and it never feels satisfying. It's this idea of eternal dissatisfaction. And again, he's pointing out that there's certainly grounds to think that there's an evolutionary adaptation reason for this dissatisfaction, to always want more. But then to Maritza's point, to think about, well, how can we also think about, once we're conscious of these biases, ways that we can take control and still find actual satisfaction and meaning and appreciation for all the good things that surround us. Ready for
And we'll
the
see that,
next.
and we'll see that theme here throughout as we go throughout the chapter. It's just a recurring theme with slightly different nuances.
Mhm. So the next part of the chapter was all about chaos and consciousness. This is the idea that by our evolutionary nature, we're predisposed to entropy, to chaos. The main point here is the mind is not going to fall into ordered and enjoyable patterns of experience unless one spends energy to give consciousness shape. He says here, it could be argued that chaos, not order, is the natural state of the mind. The fact that the mind experiences unpleasant disorder when not engaged in goal-directed action is an important safety feature provided to us by evolution. But as he points here, the mind needs ordered information to keep itself ordered. As long as it has clear goals and receives feedback, consciousness keeps humming along. When that's missing, chaos returns. When no external stimulation engages attention, thoughts tend to drift randomly and disconnected ideas appear out of nowhere. So this was the part of the chapter I thought that started to get us connected back to the idea of flow, because we had discussed in the flow book that this was what flow was all about. It was about order in consciousness. It was about having clear goals and immediate feedback, and that this is what part of what produced the state of happiness in flow. And here, I think he's starting to point out the fact that this is not just an automatic or default state of the mind, that there's probably something that we actually have to do to get into flow or to get essentially that order. But again, he's really focused here more on the problem aspect of it, the ways in which we'll just fall into chaos and entropy without consciously putting in and intentionally putting some order to our consciousness.
This is a concept that we here at 52 Ideas have embraced too. This idea of chaos versus order is one that is just a central theme that we find is pervasive in almost any philosophical work, right? And so the idea here, and I think, it says it could be argued. We tend to embrace the idea that chaos is the natural state of the mind. And it takes us back to our favorite, okay, well, I don't know if it's your favorite, but we're gonna, I'm gonna say our favorite word from the flow book, intention. When we walk forward with intention, we're aware that what we're trying to do is minimize this psychic entropy, which is what is caused by chaos. And I really, what is most fascinating to me here is this line that paradoxically, it is when we are ostensibly most free, when we can do anything we want, that we are least able to act. And why is that? Because the wheels start turning in our head and we are our own worst enemy. How many times have you sat there, or even if you're about to jump off of an 8-foot diving board, right? You have to talk to yourself, okay, maybe some people are fearless, right? Me, I'm the world's biggest puss. So I'm gonna sit on top of this 8-foot board and I'm gonna have to literally talk myself into jumping off of this diving board. Now I can swim. I'm so buoyant that it's almost impossible for me to drown. So it's really just my mind that's stopping me from jumping into the water and swimming off like nothing. And I think that that's what we're being told here, that when you're aware of that, you can kind of wrangle your mind and make it do your bidding, as opposed to being enslaved to all of the pinging thoughts that hit us when we allow our brains to roam free. And we're all subject to it. It's just one of those things. And here the admission again is that following the path or allowing our natural tendencies to take over is actually detrimental to us aligning ourselves in that sweet spot. Remember, we want to be on that forward moving path. But the way to doing that requires us to be aware of the chaos, and to make steps to move forward despite it, and find some way to gain a little bit of order. Thank you.
I will agree. I also really like this point, that the statement you're bringing up about the paradox of when we have the freedom, that is when we're least able to act. It reminds me of one of the chapters in the original Flow book where he was talking about the paradox of work. And the paradox there is that most people, when asked, prefer to not work. That's what they say. They prefer to have more leisure time. But in fact, when people then actually think about where they experience the most happiness, it turns out that people are most satisfied on the job, precisely because there are goals, there is feedback, there is that sense of purpose. That is when most people, it turns out, actually do end up feeling most fulfilled and most happy. Whereas in leisure, it's just aimless. It feels like chaos. And it turns out that in fact, most people are not as happy when they just have leisure time. To me, the other really interesting connection here that he doesn't yet get into, because he's really more focused on the problems more than the solutions, is the connection to creativity. It's that same sort of phenomenon that when we're essentially free to do anything, we're just absolutely paralyzed. It's the common experience of when you're staring at the blank page or the blank canvas. And if it could be anything, it ends up becoming absolutely nothing. Whereas when we actually give ourselves some kind of constraints, that's really when our creativity can flourish. But again, something he doesn't quite get into yet in this chapter, where he's really just more outlining the problems. Oh, do we skip one there? Yeah, here we go. Yes. So now we're on to why is happiness so elusive is the next section of the chapter here. And the main point here, it says here on the slide, we may have genetic predispositions against finding contentment, but if we let our individual consciousness be directed by genetic instructions that have been advantageous in the past, the quality of our life is likely to suffer in the present. And so here he's even starting to point out that some of the adaptations that we have from evolution came from conditions that existed in the past that aren't necessarily part of our modern experiences. But if we merely let ourselves be moved by whatever it is that evolution has programmed into our nature, that we're not going to find happiness living in modern society today. So like one of the points here he makes, is that like depression, anger, fear, and jealousy are different manifestations of conflict in consciousness, a form of psychic entropy. When the mind dwells on something negative, attention turns to information that conflicts with goals and creates a discrepancy between what is desired and what is actually happening. So again, just the ways in which our genetic predispositions can have us perhaps focused on things that happened in the past, or maybe worrying about things that might happen in the future, but we're not actually in tune with what's actually happening now in the present and the opportunities that might actually be available to us here and now.
And here you can see, as we keep going through the slides, you see we have a theme, and it's the same thing, genetic predispositions. But use consciousness to allow yourself to walk past it. And this is going to be the ongoing theme of this chapter.
I think we're ready for the next one. So our next section is called The Limits of Reason. Here he points out it's good to have rational, logical structures by which to order thoughts and actions, but human evolution cannot be tied to strict rules. Intuition, empathy, wisdom, and creativity are themselves part of the human evolutionary process. They change with time as events and our understanding of them change. I thought this part of the chapter makes even more sense to us now in the 2020s as opposed to the 1990s when he was writing this, because I think we're all familiar with the concept of an algorithm and what can be programmed by a certain kind of logical algorithmic programming. And here I see him making the point that essentially algorithms and logic obviously help us a lot, and we all know that living in the computer age, but that obviously they can't solve all of our problems. As he points out here, that we still also need intuition, empathy, wisdom, creativity, that all of these are values, and that part of our challenge here is being able to balance logic, rationality, algorithms with intuition, empathy, creativity, and such.
I agree with Joya. I absolutely love this section. It's one of my favorites of the entire chapter. The idea here is that, again, we are not creatures of either or. We are yes and creatures. There is benefit to embracing both sides. Sure, reason is good, logic is good, it's necessary. But embracing it at the expense of these necessary emotions is actually going to be detrimental. My absolute favorite line in this chapter is the last one that I added here for you guys. It's if we want more rational behavior, we cannot expect it to happen by itself. We must invest psychic energy in creating and preserving ordered systems of rules. Now, what that's telling you here is, again, what we hear in some of the other sections we've already looked at. The idea of help yourself. Because sometimes the way to help yourself is by fighting against what is innate within you. And that seems almost paradoxical, but I mean, we are human beings. I honestly think the human being is a paradoxical creature, because we are creatures who can perform logic. But at our very base, we are emotional animals. So to throw away the emotion that is innate in you is going to lead you down the wrong path. I mean, you can probably get away with it for a time, but ultimately, you're going to find that you would have fared better if you had managed to find a way to balance the two. So that's what I'm hearing here in this section. And I think that this is such a vital point. Also, what I really love here is that they change with time as events and our understanding of them change. And when he says they, he's talking again, Joya read out for us, intuition, empathy, wisdom, creativity. Those are vital. If we embrace reason and logic without remembering how vital those aspects of ourselves, of our culture, of our society, that those pieces are, we're going to have issue. And the idea is, whenever you're not moving, if there's no forward motion, you start to die. And that's just the way it is. It holds true also for this. Individually, culturally, societally, we need to embrace those emotional aspects of ourselves as tightly and as strongly as we embrace the logical and reasoning aspects of ourselves. That's the best path forward and the best way to change it in a slightly more harmonious nature that's not going to be traumatizing to either the individual or the society or culture as well.
No, I think absolutely would underline everything that you're saying there. And I think it is just, I'll just bring in, our favorite word of intention. Again, this is just another way in which we need to use our intention to actually find this balance so that we can have this continual progress. I think we're ready for the next section. So the next part here, we're going to talk about the problem of the addiction to pleasure. So here the main point is if excessive rationality is dangerous, so is an excessive confidence in the wisdom of the body. Evolution hasn't caught up to technology, and the brain won't tell us when enough is enough. The only way to avoid becoming dangerously dependent on pleasure is to use the mind. And again, this is a point that I think we even understand better and with more data and evidence now in the 2020s than was even available in the late 90s when MC was writing this. But even then, he was pointing out the fact that the examples he gives here, salts, fat, sugar, alcohol, sex, pornography, all of these examples of things that if we get them as they were perhaps available in the past, in moderation, only a little bit, they can give us a little jolt of pleasure, but they are problematic if we have them in excess. And of course, the abundance of our modern society just makes it all too easy to indulge too much in these pleasures that don't actually provide long-term meaning, satisfaction, nutrition, and the way that he makes the point here, I thought was really interesting, that the way that he says the wisdom of the body isn't enough. And even here is making a point that I feel we perhaps even hear more now in the 2020s, that you will hear people say, just trust the body, or just listen to whatever your intuition might be. And while there's certainly places where I believe that is correct, kind of just as we were just talking about how intuition definitely has its place, and your gut feeling, your sense of things is very important, there's also this other danger to watch out for, that we can't just rely on perhaps what gives us a dopamine high, or what gives us that hit of pleasure that's pure hedonism, but not actually long-term value, deep meaning, actual nutrition, the things that actually support and sustain us for a long-term life of deep happiness.
Absolutely. And so the thing here is the idea of, again, floating. If you're just floating along in the world, you're really susceptible to becoming dependent on just those things that feel good, right? It's so easy in today's day and age to be like, I don't want to worry about anything that's hard. I don't want any drama. And that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But if you become so against those things that might force you to strive, well, then that becomes a link to enabling you to become dependent on only seeking pleasure and failing to use your mind at all.
Right. So is there one more slide we have here? So here we have the good and the bad. And his main point here is the only value that all human beings can readily share is the continuation of life on Earth. Oh,
it's not.
Oh, yeah, I was saying. Oh yeah, sorry. Yes.
Sorry.
So we still have stress, strain, and hormones, and then we'll get to the good and the bad. So first, those stress, strain, and hormones. So here the main point was the adaptive skills of the past, which have made it possible for us to exist in the first place, do not necessarily make life easier or happier now. Certain basic evolutionary drives cannot be eradicated, and so we must learn to satisfy them in meaningful ways. So here, for example, he talks about stress. He says stress triggers physiological changes that prepare the body for, we know, like the fight or flight choice there. But excessive or prolonged stress can be harmful because it throws the the balance of the body off. The key to staying healthy is not to seek to change external stressors, but to change one's mind. And I would argue here that it's really probably ideally even both. I always think of that as the balance of the Western and the Eastern approaches to how to deal with suffering in life, is that, again, it's not either or, but it's both and, that we want to both change the world and change ourselves. And then also, just kind of a point here about hormones playing a large role in stress as well, and how these are part of our evolutionary programming. They're not things that we can just change at will, but we can still be intentional, just given the nature of our bodies, the actions and choices that we choose to make. So for example, testosterone might predispose us to be more aggressive, which might have even had a place, if we had to fight off a saber-toothed tiger. But living in modern society, we might actually have to be intentional, to bring up our favorite word again, to think about how we actually take some of our hormonal predispositions and think about how they actually provide value for us in the modern world.
I really want to say this is actually the last section in this chapter. I apologize to those of you who grabbed the presentation, the next slide is actually from chapter 1. The good and the bad is from chapter 1. My apologies. But on this topic here, stress, strain, and hormones, it actually was very hard to condense the things discussed into just these couple bullets. But most of what was presented to us were various examples of how it is that these things affect us. And then the key point here that they're telling us is the idea of, they were necessary previously. It may no longer be necessary. We are deluding ourselves if we think that because we've just now, over the last 50 years, begun to break away from some of these things ingrained within us. We're deluding ourselves if we think that that small amount of time is enough to change something that's an evolutionary trait or a genetic instruction. And so what we're told here is that it's just a matter of being aware that there are things within you that are affecting your actions and your behaviors. And once you have that awareness, then you have the potential ability to fight against it, which is, it's this idea of just paying attention. If something is, if you make this like really strong reaction to something, maybe take a step back and consider, where's this coming from? Because it's innate to you. But just because it's innate within you, it doesn't mean that you have to go from reaction to action. We are thinking animals in addition to emotional animals. And so what this here section is saying, there's all these things that are this like crazy cocktail inside of you. So you're gonna have to work really hard to not let it all explode forth, because what the author is telling us, what MC is really getting at, is that if we keep acting upon all of these things within us without taking that pause to consider that it is part of the genetic instruction and that potentially we need to rise above that because it no longer fits with today's world. If we don't account for that, then there's no way we can move into a newer, brighter, better future. And that's what I'm hearing him saying here.
I think that even leads us beautifully into the next part of our meeting, which is going to be getting into breakout sessions. And so the topic or the question we thought you could all ponder today in the breakout rooms is precisely to start thinking about your own ideas for suggestions of ways to overcome all of these limits. So we, went throughout this chapter pointing out all of the limits, the chaos, what's just built into us by genetics and evolution. But MC doesn't really yet get into the suggestions for how to overcome and improve on any of these things. So we thought this could be what we could start to have our conversations about starting in the breakout rooms, perhaps especially thinking about the definition of flow as we presented it to you in the very first slide, or maybe anything that you might have gotten from our exploration of that first book if you were there for that first part of the series, or even just anything from your own life experience for ways that you perhaps have thought about dealing with some of these inbuilt limits that we have that predispose us toward negativity, and how we can rise above and overcome that and actually achieve lives of deeper, greater satisfaction, meaning, and happiness.
I wrote a synopsis of that question into the chat for you guys.
All right. So anything else you want to say? Otherwise, I'm going to get us started in the breakout rooms.
Go right ahead.
All right. Then I will start the breakout rooms. Everyone's starting to come back. Welcome back, everyone. We're all starting to filter back to the main room. Hopefully everybody had some really interesting discussions with your small group. And so now we're going to get to the section of the meeting where we come back together and you can share any questions that came up, either for you individually from the presentation we gave, if you read the chapters, any really interesting questions you might have had that came out in the breakout room, or any takeaways that you wanted to share and discuss further with the group. So first, we're going to go around and get everyone's questions. You can type exclamation point in the chat or use the raise hand function on Zoom here. And we'll collect everybody's questions and discussion points, and then we'll see how many we can get through. But yeah, if anybody would like to share their thoughts or their questions. Looks like Shane Marie has something to get us started here.
Yes, hi. One of the things that I was curious about is how you say you find an avenue of transformation, of change. The momentum behind that seems to be faulty often at times. So, so I'm curious as to how you gain proper momentum for transformation. So even though we hear things about this path or that path might take us to transformation, we might start on it and find we just don't have sufficient incentive to stay on it for transformation. So if you could speak to that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great topic. Were there any specific examples you were thinking of, or just broadly for, momentum for transformation broadly?
I think just generically. So, there are moments in a I don't know, a lesser moment, a depressed moment, a weaker moment, you might find yourself meditating or those kinds of things, and it serves you well in that moment. But then once things are well, the sun's out, and those kinds of things, you kind of fall off. So there's I don't know, there's something lacking in terms of staying the course, and I'm not quite sure how you navigate that.
No, I think that's a great topic. Definitely one worth exploring. Let me see. Joe also had an exclamation in the chat.
Yeah, I was trying to decide. Maybe I'll just ask a question. Is actually, how do people approach bringing order to chaos? And so it was, he's saying I thought I read in one of the slides that he's saying chaos is our natural state. So I'd like to just hear what some people's ideas are on how they actually bring order to their world.
I think another big, broad, fascinating topic, one I think that'll definitely be worth exploring. Would anybody else like to add a question to our mix here? You can continue thinking on that. Otherwise, I think we can even get started with this big question of, finding momentum to keep a transformation going. I have a lot to say about this, but I'm going to be really curious to hear from others as well. And this is certainly something I've experienced, where at the beginning, you're all excited. You've got that vision of the new change. You've got like the first couple of days where it's all really new and interesting. And then, it can be so easy to just, stay the course. So yeah, I'd love to hear, other people's thoughts about how they keep momentum when making a transformation. Anybody want to share some strategies that have worked for them?
I'll chime in there for a moment. So I think looking at things from various different angles tends to add awareness to it. So like if you've gone down the path of wondering something, you think, oh well, maybe I'm bored with this angle. You can look at it from a different way, and that will kind of infuse some new life into the topic. For I guess in general of keeping the momentum is like the idea of, so it takes us again back to our little graph, the skills versus challenges graph is if your skills and challenges are just right, you're in the sweet spot, you're in the flow chart. If you get too much skills and not enough challenge, you're gonna find yourself bored without ambition, right? So then you have to increase your skills. If your skills are too great, if the other way around, if your challenges are too great and you don't have enough skills, you're going to find yourself frustrated and anxious, and you're going to be outside of that good middle path. So then what you want to do is you want to work on your skills. So I think the key here is just keep moving, like it's a matter of, and skills, we say skills, and I think skills is a very generic term that covers such a wide, vast range of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be you're going back to school. It just could be something small, take a step back and if it's something so simple of, washing dishes, maybe the technique you have doesn't work for you. Maybe you need to start doing dishes in the morning. And because in the morning you're sipping your coffee while you're doing the dishes, that helps you be a little more energized about doing that task, as opposed to doing them in the evening when you're tired and sleepy. And I know that's a really, silly almost argument, example, but it's just to show that as you move along in your skills and challenges, you can keep momentum. And what you want is keep momentum, but you have to adjust one or the other. And which one you have to adjust requires a self-assessment. Are you feeling more bored or are you feeling more anxious? Because if you're more bored, it means that you don't have enough challenge to match the skill set. If you're feeling more anxious and maybe frustrated, then the possibility is that the challenges are too high compared to your skill set. So those are just a couple thoughts I have.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Maritza. Joe had something to say about this question, and then Anton had something to share as well.
Just briefly, how do you keep the momentum going? I think one major thing is to be self-aware in that process. So what does that mean? We talked a little bit about being on the hedonic treadmill. So then how do you avoid that? What are the processes that you use in order to make sure that you don't give into your desires and you're actually able to exert your own will to whatever degree you have it over your actions. So I think that's important to know what your behaviors are. The second part I would say is that it's also important is to I think community actually plays a very big role here, and essentially how especially community in the sense that your values have to be aligned with one another. And if that is a form of accountability, then you can kind of keep the momentum going because you feel like you're not necessarily, running in place or doing everything on your own. So I think that those are two kind of critical things, because I think or three really, become self-aware, but also most importantly is to know your, pitfalls, where you're going to fall back and where you're going to fail. And in certain cases where you can't fail. So those would be my answer.
These are both really great points. Thank you for sharing those. Anton, and then Mark go next.
I've noticed that there are, I'll just say something briefly before I ask the question. I noticed that in many cases, or most of the time, like when I listen to personal development and podcasts or like YouTube videos, there's so much emphasis on the change, especially when it's big change, but not any really talk about, well, until you get there, about the pleasure or about enjoyment. So should enjoyment be tied in with personal development as much as possible? I mean, I have my thoughts about that, but I wonder what other people have to say about that. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. Yeah, I think we'll definitely add that one to the list. Thank you for sharing that one. Next up is going to be Marco.
Yeah, for me, like I kind of know, just like sometimes even just taking a small step, especially if it's in like when you're sort of like in the just continuing with something like you're sort of like in a new place, so it basically like that gives you momentum. It's like it brings you to that new place. So yeah, and sort of like that gives you sort of a little happiness to like to continue to keep on going.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing, Marco. Yeah, I'll even build on that and maybe share a couple other things. But your point about small steps, I think that even connects into one of the key insights we get from MC, and one of the things that I've taken away from studying flow, which is exactly this idea of breaking things into small chunks. So one of the things we learn about flow is that you want to have clear goals and immediate feedback, and you want to be in that sweet spot of the challenge, skills, balance. Sometimes one of the easiest ways to do that is to take a big transformation and break it down into small chunks, and then the small chunk, you have a very clear goal. It's not write a novel, it's sit down and write 200 words. And if it's just write 200 words, that's a very clear goal. You can get immediate feedback as to whether you've done it or not, and that hopefully puts you, let's say, in the sweet spot where it makes it easier to get that done. I'll share another strategy I found for momentum is an idea that's often called friction. And it's the idea that you want to essentially add friction when you're trying to do a transformation of something you're trying to avoid, but remove friction, when you're trying to make something easier. So these are the kinds of examples, like, for example, if you're trying to, let's say, exercise more, you want to remove friction. So you want to make it as easy as possible for you to get your workout in. So you want to, clear out your schedules so that, you have a definite time set up. You want to set out all your work clothes in advance so that, you've got everything ready to go. You want to make it as easy as possible to do the thing. I think that even aligns with, in some of our other groups, we've talked about Montessori and the prepared environment. Like, these are even just ways as you as an adult can prepare your own environment to make things easier. Or sometimes you want to make things harder. Like, for example, if you're trying to lose weight, you can make it harder to eat cookies by, not buying the cookies in the first place. Or, if you do have, sweets in the house, you lock them on a high shelf, or you just make it the environment more difficult to do the thing that you're not trying to do. So that's something else. And another big idea on this topic that I learned that I think is really insightful, it probably only applies to certain cases, but this was an idea I got from James Clear's book, Atomic Habits, which is, I'll share, it's just been the best book I've ever read about thinking about how to build habits. And he had this really profound idea, I thought. He was talking about when you're trying to build habits, sometimes there's things that are perhaps goal oriented, but sometimes it's even easier to focus on the process than the goal. So this would be like, if you're trying to lose weight, instead of trying to say like, oh, I'm trying to lose 20 pounds, it might be easier to say, oh, I'm going to commit to, eating a certain diet and doing a certain exercise routine, because that's the process, right? So like focusing on the process is often easier than just, having that big abstract goal. And then he makes this point that even better than focusing on the process is focusing on identity. So this was this insight he had that people who identify with the ultimate result have better outcomes overall. So this is, if you identify yourself with, let's say, like being someone who's intellectually curious, then you're probably more likely to keep showing up at 52 Living Ideas, because like now you've made this is part of your sense of who you are. So you'll be more committed to actually doing the thing because you've made it part of your own sense of identity. I always thought that was a really profound idea. Looks like Shane Marie has something more to say about her topic, and then Erin as well.
I think Erin.
Oh, Erin at first, though? Okay, all right. So Erin first, and then Shane Marie on her topic.
I mean, Shane Marie could go if she's in the flow. She wants to.
No, it's okay, Erin. You were first, so you can go.
Cool. So I've always sort of divided these things up into sort of, like three categories. One is there's this sort of hacking phase, which I find a lot of self-help or performance, improvement is driven around. And I don't minimize it. I actually think it's really important for one simple reason, is that if we can try things in very small bites that we actually don't know if we really want, we think we do, or the pleasure trigger tells us we do, i.e., I want to learn how to play guitar because, 48 other reasons have nothing to do with, truly understanding the history of guitar, blah, 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 blah. Well, yeah, that's great. You can take your first sort of 6 months of that, maybe hacking and YouTubing and all that kind of stuff. But then there's a moment where it's like, okay, there's no more, there's the shortcuts have worse ROI than sort of punching through it. And then I find that what I think is great about the hacking is that I think it's like tapas. It lets us all try lots of little things. It has, kind of no harm, no foul. And it and we kind of live a life, over decades, if we're lucky, hopefully, or half a century as adults or more in the adult phase. And we could try, dozens of things that we put, decent effort in. But at some point we're like, no, that's good. I got enough of that, right? I know I'll never actually be really good. And I don't actually care enough to be actually really good, et cetera. And then you kind of drop it and go do something else. Now, I would say there's a set of things that at some point you might decide that is really important. Then I think the hacking has to go through this sort of transformation to, I don't have a term for this, but it's basically like, I call it like the nice grind, but it's a grind. Like you got to be willing to just grind it out. Like it's real now. Like it's meaningful enough that it's not a grind to you, that the journey is the value. And at that point, you're figuring out if this is something you're really committing enough to, that you at some point might make a decision around it. Like it might be something that important that you decide to go in a different direction in your life. Now there's probably only a handful of those things we really do ever. I'm not saying we don't luck into some of those. I think we actually luck into a lot of those. Like you get a job and something you didn't really know you wanted to do it. You did it long enough, you get really good at it. You did the grind and didn't even realize you're doing the grind because everyone else is. And now pretty soon you're good at it. And you're just sort of like there, and people and yourself, you can just do it any day of the week and Sunday. Now, you might not at that point say, well, I want to be the professor of my job. Like that would actually be the commitment to that. You're going to be like, no, that's good enough. Like I'm good enough doing the 9 to 5 of that. And then that's that. But I think there's a set of things, maybe a handful in our lives that maybe it's this type of stuff too, right? Where, you get on this train where you want to, discover 1,000 different ideas. And that's your sort of journey. Now, at some point you might say, well, I don't really want to teach this. Like, I don't want the duty. And I think that's the key. Like, is there a point that you want the duty? Because I think that's the third phase. And I think it's like 0 to like maybe 2 of those in our whole life that we actually want the duty to something. Like we're just, like I'm moving here and I'm going to have the duty. And it's like my whole life's getting restructured around it. And I just think and to me, I sort of divide these. So momentum to me matters. It's a different form of momentum for each of those. I would argue the third one is the professional athlete version of that thing. Like if any of you've ever, met or know people like that, I have. I grew up with some in California, and when you stop, they kept going, and then 10 years later they still go. Like that's their job, like that's their vocation. It's different, right? It's not cool. Like this isn't about fun coolness. This is like serious. This is their spreadsheets basically, and to me that's the third category. The first category is, I want to try Italian cooking, so I buy 5 books, I buy some gear, I stumble my way through it. And then after like 4 months of YouTube, you're like, okay, I don't suck at it, but I don't want to go to Italy for 2 years and study it to become a bad version of a very great cook, because that's probably what you'll get to at that point. Because now you have to grind for like 10 years to become maybe an average, very good cook. You know what I mean? And it's like, you got to be willing to do like 50 years, 30 years. And so I just think that's how I'm sorry if I went like way off the edge here, but that's how I kind of view things like momentum, and really the whole concept of our development is to try to figure out like which of these, because it's really easy to get sucked in nowadays to anything. you can get on a coffee kick. Well, I want to understand coffee, blah, 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 blah. Or well, how's this made? Oh, this part of Northern Kenya. And at a certain point, you're like, you know what? I don't know anything. Like, stop. You know what I mean? Like, let me go back to like, I'm gonna buy what I like because it tastes good. And I'm not going to try to create some intellectual rubric to make myself sound smarter than myself around it. Like, it's just, now, some people that's important too, so knock yourself out. I just don't think that's a fantastic use of your time, because, you know, you could just spend your energy doing a lot of other positive things. But to me, that's a lot. That's why it's really easy now with the internet, digital, social, knowledge, Amazon, everything. You can become a fake mixologist in like 6 days and like trick a family member, you know, because you can make one drink really well, you know.
Yeah,
So
thank
anyway.
you. Oh, yeah, go ahead,
Yeah.
Marissa.
I want to comment on some of the concepts that Aaron has brought up here. So, you know, I think that the key here is that if the purpose for which you're acquiring this knowledge of the coffee is just to impress your friends or just to sound intelligent, well, you've missed the point. And you're never going to enter into a flow state if you're seeking that path. The idea here is, remember that flow state is you're not even thinking about anyone. You're not thinking about competition. You're not thinking about other people around you. You're like in the zone. And if you're worrying about who's going to see you or who's going to be better than you or know more than you, you're totally not in the zone. You're not in flow state. So what modern technology affords us is that you're correct. It affords us a very easy ability to obtain information. But something I like to say to people is Google knows everything, but it understands nothing. If you are interested in a topic and you're seeking to understand said topic, it doesn't matter if there are people halfway around the world who are better Italian pasta makers than you. If taking the time and spending 10 hours to create an amazing gravy is what floats your boat, and if while doing it, you're so immersed that you forget time, you forget.
Oh, I think she froze.
Oh no.
She was in the zone. She was in the
She
zone. Like, you
was.
forget your kids, you forget your time, you forget your job,
You forgot what
your
you were
husband,
saying,
your wife,
and it
your boyfriend,
freezes.
whatever.
Yes. No, I'll
Your
just pick up
bills,
that
you know.
from Marissa. No. And just to thank you, because I think, you know, this is a great point, even, you know, that you know, momentum is not just this one thing, that, you know, depending on what our goals are, that the kind of momentum we need will change. And I was even just going to tie it back to our favorite word of intentionality, because it seems that that's what's more important than ever. So even to pick up on Maritza's example, you know, if it might have been the case, you know, if it were, you know, a couple hundred years ago, if you were growing up in Italy, learning how to make the Italian sauce was maybe the only cooking skill that was available for you to learn. Where now, you know, because of the wealth of information that's available to us, we could learn just about anything if we really wanted to. There does seem to be a YouTube video for just about anything you might want to learn. But I think, you know, this is your point, then we just have to be even that much more intentional to think about how do we actually want to spend our time, and what are the aspects that we really want to devote ourselves to. And to your point, that knowing that, you know, our time here still is finite and we can't do everything. You know, hopefully we'll soon even maybe be getting the technology where we'll be living longer. But even in that scenario, you can't certainly even do everything all at once. So just how it's even that much more important to maybe think about what the goals we really want to pursue are and how we want to spend our time. I do want to turn it back to Shane Marie, though, because this was her question, and hear some of her further thoughts on this topic.
Actually, it's funny because I think Aaron was touching upon exactly my next question is, how do we be sure to delegate time appropriately, and especially as we're older. I'm older, I'm almost 50. And so I don't know how you trust the mind. Right. I don't know how you trust the mind to establish legitimate goals for yourself. And so I think there is some care that needs to be taken in that, and not only care, but insight. And I'm not sure how you maneuver towards that insight, and what are the means. Is there anything that kind of helps self-identify the goals that we should pursue? And when we do pursue those goals, what are our expectations, and should we hope to find from them, and those kinds of things, because I just find those things hard to answer. I love to write. I've been writing for years, but I've made nothing of it. So I'm just not quite sure what to expect of these things that I'm naturally inclined towards, but I haven't made anything major out of them. So I'm not sure if I'm putting a question out there, but you know, one of the things we mentioned in our group real quickly is that, you know, for some people, they seem to show up in life, or at least they suggest that they know exactly what their goal is and what their end game is. They're comfortable with the detours and the failures and those kind of things. But I feel like for me, I've shown up with a hint, some suggestions, but I don't have that clear vision. And so I feel a little faulty in my efforts and my first steps, because I don't have this absolute clear sense of what I'm aiming for. I have some sense, some whiffs, some notions of where I would like to aim, but it is not absolutely clear like you hear other people suggest. Thank you.
No, that's great. A great question. So I'm gonna try to look for something to put it in the chat for you. Something that actually comes out of the Flow Research Collective. So they have this whole idea of, I'm not gonna remember off the top of my head exactly what they call it, but it's essentially they talk about stacking your curiosity, passion, and purpose. So they have this whole process that you can go through that starts even with your curiosities, because that's even sort of the first point. You know, what actually even just sort of arouses your interest. So even just to start with a process of getting clear about even just the kinds of topics that interest you, because you know, even in the field of everything that's interesting, you know, some people might have at least some interest in Italian cooking, and for others there would be like no interest in that whatsoever. So the first step is even maybe going through and just kind of broadly listing through a bunch of you know, curiosities, and then kind of spending time in kind of what Aaron's perhaps called like the hacking phase. You know, even just spending some time, you know, kind of like once you have that big list, maybe kind of like narrowing it down, spending just a little bit of time going through some things, seeing, you know, like if you actually do have this kind of deeper interest, you know, if there are these topics that you want to get into more. And then the point that they make here in the Flow Research Collective is, so they talk about that stage even as finding passion. So like, so curiosity is kind of that broad stage where it's like, these are the things you might want to dabble in. And then, you know, from curiosity, it could become a passion. This is something that you might actually want to start spending some time into, like where you're really like an amateur, right? And we know like the root of that word amateur is, you know, the ama, it's the love, right? So you have like the passion for something. But then they have this notion of transforming passion to purpose. And I thought this was fascinating too, because the Flow Research Collective, they make this point then of connecting your passion to something wider than yourself. To have a purpose that goes even beyond just your interest, to something where you can actually make a positive contribution to the world. And then, you know, from that, even thinking about there's this phrase that Stephen Kotler and Peter Diamandis have about, you know, having your massively transformative purpose. So even just being really ambitious ultimately in thinking about how you would combine some of your passions to really come up with a purpose that could really make a really great impact. And that's one of, you know, the best ways to ultimately find long-term meaning. So I'm going to take a few moments to even see if I can find that link for you. But next, I think we'll even maybe jump into Joe's question, which was the question of how you personally approach bringing order to chaos. So that was one of the ideas that we were discussing in this chapter, that chaos and entropy seems to be the natural state that we have to stave off. So if people maybe want to share some of their strategies or techniques or approaches for how you bring order you know, to your consciousness out of chaos. Anybody want to share some of their own personal thoughts on that one? All right, let's see. Aaron has some thoughts, and then Joe will be next on his own question.
Yeah, so unless it's, you know, critical, defined as, you know, existential health, you know, taking care of little kids, you know, lose your job, you know, like these maybe handful of things that are, you know, 8, 10, 12 things. I find the easiest thing to do is to just stop doing something, you know, so you just slow down. So you basically, when it's a chaotic environment, you know, whatever, you're whatever environment it could be, but you go over to your, best friend's house from college, they're having a party, they're an adult, but they're sort of this adult kid. And so it's a train wreck and that's not organized and everyone's running around. They're sending people to the store, whatever. Now you could choose to jump into that. And that's cool. Like if they're that friend, then it's sort of like, that's fun-ish, I guess. But if they're really not, you can hide, you can look busy, you can get sucked in, or you can just kind of glide away until things sort of stabilize. And so I'm using that example, but I think you could use that in lots, or you can take something like that in family and in friends and in work environments even. There's some environments you can't do that, right? If there's a true emergency, a health emergency, whatever, that's different. But the one advantage, you more often than not, if you're in a near dense environment, is that when there's something actually dangerous, you can call the fire department, you can call, paramedics, right? You can, if it's health related, you could really actually get professionals more often than not very quickly, or reasonably quick. So more often, so you're rarely in a situation where you can't stop. To me, the only reason people don't stop is they get uncomfortable, right? Because they don't want to get judged. Like, how come you're not helping? It's like, well, because this sucks. Like I don't want to contribute to it, and I don't think I'll make a difference, and it'll kind of make me a little crazy right now, and you probably don't want me to be that way. And so, yeah, is that a good enough reason? It's, and I'm being a little more crude, obviously, when I say that, but my point is that you sort of stop. That's what I've discovered, is that's a really, for me, a useful thing. And you can use it. Now, a lot of people might respond. Well, what I found is you don't really tell people you're doing this, because people will, maybe not really enjoy that. But and right, it almost feels like you're quitting on people, right? It's in but you find a way to do that, and I found it work. And then if and what I've discovered is, after a period of time, because you've sort of disconnected, if there can't be any order, assuming, then that environment is happening, and then you have to make a choice to say, well, I'm going to just dive in and whatever, or you find some little piece of it you can, add value in, or you can just, like run away, basically. So I don't know if that probably doesn't appeal to anybody, but it's something. I mean, I don't advertise that. I don't put a shirt on like, when it sucks, I quit, and then it's like, and then I add value when it makes sense, like I don't have that t-shirt because I don't think most people want that, but I mean, basically.
Oh, no, thank you for sharing your perspective there. Joe, you had some thoughts here on your question?
Yeah, no, the main reason I'd asked is because I've just seen so many different approaches for people that they take when bringing order to their own lives. So, I mean, you think about it, people have either a growth or a fixed mindset, and people that have fixed mindsets often have this idea that they're bringing order, but they're actually, in a sense, creating a certain amount of disorder, because they're actually just not changing their perspective on the world. However, there is a certain comfort that comes with that, a lot of risk as well. You're not confronting, let's just say, your inner dragons, your ego, whatever you want to call it. So then there's this growth mindset that also brings order, and it brings order by incorporating new information and how quickly you can incorporate that information. And I found that obviously the most important thing in that process is to ask questions. But it's interesting to see how people will, will take those two different approaches. I would argue the fixed mindset is actually more or less aligned with their own personal desires, which can be problematic, and gets back to, some of the hedonic behaviors that we had talked about previously in the chapter. Because if you're obviously you don't want to open up, then you're going to probably revert back into whatever it is that you actually want to do, as opposed to growing and embracing this chaos or unknown. So those are my thoughts, because I'd seen so many different, those are a couple different variations, but it's interesting to see how people approach those things. And sometimes it works for both, in both cases. I know a lot of people that have fixed mindsets that are, I don't want to say happy, but they're okay with it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. No, and then that's even, I think, an interesting way to approach the question of, ways that we can maybe attempt to bring order that don't actually ultimately bring order, like the fixed mindset. But I've seen what you're saying too, that there is that if the choice is between order and chaos, that a fixed mindset is maybe better, because it gives you, at least, as you pointed out, like some level of comfort. There's some level of order, so you're not just going crazy. It's interesting how even the ways that we describe going crazy are all about kind of falling into chaos. It's like you're falling to pieces. You don't have anything under control. So that, in that sense, maybe a fixed mindset is better than chaos. But then, to your point, that still a fixed mindset ultimately doesn't really give you the best kind of order, and that there's a growth mindset that actually gives you true order, because the fixed mindset, the order will ultimately break down there. You're on mute there, Joe.
Could I add one thing to that?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Really quickly, but it's interesting, because I've thought about this a lot lately, and just how sometimes if people, if you're more provincial, that you'll actually be, that people are very happy with that, versus actually, getting out into the unknown, in the sense that, getting outside their comfort zone. And it's interesting just to see that dynamic and how it works for people in certain cases, because that could be considered fixed when I say provincial in the sense. So anyway.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It looks like was Rogine, who I don't know if I got your name correctly. Let me know if I got your name right. Oh, perfect.
That's right. Yeah. I've been really thinking a lot about the hedonic principle for months now, and trying to take it to heart. And at least right now, what's helping me with internal chaos is to write down as much as I can figure out that's chaotic, and then using the hedonic principle, sort of go through and cross out. It's like, yeah, even if I get that, even if I can play that sonata on the piano perfectly in a month, it's like, so what? Then I'll think I should do the next one. So at least for me, focusing on the hedonic principle has greatly simplified my life. It's like, yep, I don't want to compare myself to whatever because of that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think a couple of really good points there. I'll pick up on a couple of things. When you mentioned even just writing things down, that's something I've heard from other people. There's the strategy of morning pages, which comes from Julia Cameron's work on creativity, which I've heard from some friends have found that practice really helpful. So this is the idea that you essentially start off every morning by journaling a couple pages, and then the whole point is that it's the stuff that's kind of just top of mind, and the whole point is that it kind of starts to help you order your thoughts, because sort of all of that chaos that you wake up with in the morning, you get it all out on paper, and then it kind of gives you an opportunity to reflect and gives you an opportunity to order things, because you've had sort of that experience of release. And so that's a strategy I've heard from some people they find really helpful. I will share that never really worked for me, honestly, because I couldn't ever even, partly it's like I'm just not even a morning person, although Julie Cameron says you really can do this any time of day, that you can make it work. And then the whole idea is, you write it and you discard it. It's not something that you're supposed to save or keep. It really is sort of the process of writing out all the crazy chaotic thoughts and getting them out there into the world, so that then you can process them and then reflect on them. But I will share something that my own version of that I have found more helpful is I do try to make a point to get out and go for a walk. So I have a new practice now of journaling I have one of those apps where you can essentially just use the audio function and speak into the phone. And so personally, I found that even worked really well for me. So that might be a strategy that you might want to use. And then your point about, kind of focusing on what brings you pleasure. I think that'll maybe even connect in with our third question here about, should enjoyment be tied to personal development? But it looks like Shane Marie has something to say here first, and then we'll get into that last question.
Yes, I was just thinking, I mean, I can imagine personal chaos and how we bring order to that. But I think for me, I'm often wondering, and I don't find it personally in my own life yet, but it seems like it's on the precipice, and I don't know if that's the case, but say we were existing in legitimate external chaos, that the world was legitimately chaotic externally. So what is the flow state within that? Or is that even a possibility? So it's certainly clear when we're providing our own chaos, but what if, and maybe I shouldn't worry about that until it's in front of me, but I'm deeply curious if we have the skills to navigate a truly legitimate chaotic world, a truly legitimate exterior chaotic world, and how we find flow or peace within that. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just even going to add that to maybe the list of questions, because I think that's even just a whole other great question we can explore there. So I'm just going to add that to the question, but let's maybe get to the other question first, and then we'll come back to this second one. So let's even get into the question about, I think the way Anton phrased it was, should enjoyment be tied to personal development? Is that a strategy that actually helps us reach our personal development goals? Did anybody have some thoughts on that one? Let's see. It looks like Rogine here has something to say.
Maybe it's another question. I'm not that familiar with the concept of flow, except at a superficial level. But can you get to flow without some enjoyment? I'm sort of thinking flow about personal development. At least for me, I have to kind of enjoy it.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question, but certainly in the flow book, MC really ties flow to happiness. He kind of describes it as that state of intrinsic motivation where you are so engaged that what the feeling ultimately is happiness. But we've also talked about how there is the dark side of flow. So there are ways that flow can go wrong, and maybe even though it might even be one of those experiences where it perhaps might feel good in the moment, but not actually be something that really is truly of value or lead to long-term happiness. So we're going to be running out of time soon, but it's even just a really great question. And so we'll definitely add that question to ponder into the mix, to maybe even think about, what are sort of the possibilities for flow without happiness and pleasure. So let's go back just to the question still of, should enjoyment be tied to personal development? And Anton, did I have your question correct? Is that an accurate rephrasing of what you're asking there?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether or not this changes anything for you or for anyone else, but you got the question. I just added in as much as possible. Should enjoyment be tied in with personal development as much as possible? And where reasonable, I guess I'm saying,
So are you suggesting that if it's hard or unpleasant, but maybe it's something we should do anyway, but ideally we should add in pleasure as much as possible? Is that?
Yeah, that's what I was getting at, whether or not that's the way to, exactly. That's a good way of wording it. Mm-hmm.
Anybody have any thoughts on that particular idea? It looks like Joe has something maybe he wants to share on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of my understandings of, flow is essentially having the task and the skill sets aligned with one another. So within that framework, I think that there would have to be, a degree of challenge, obviously, that you would want, but it wouldn't be something that's overwhelming. So that's kind of where you kind of would find that joy in the challenge itself. You're not bored, but you're actually working towards a goal, and it's kind of like a equilibrium or something. You're striking a balance. And so so I do think that pleasure, and some of the some people say to me, and I often find it to be a very wise statement, is people say enjoy the journey. And that allows you a little bit to take a step back to see where you're headed. And it also gives you at least a chance to, to be in the present moment, and to kind of look forward. So, yeah, I think joy is part of, can be part of your personal development. That being said, it can't come, it has to be challenging. It has to be you have to feel like you've accomplished something at the end of the day. It's like meaning, in a sense. It'd be meaningless if it were just something that you were just doing routinely.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. I think that was beautifully said. It looks like Rogine has something to say then on this question.
I hope this doesn't trivialize it, but I'm realizing I have Alexa, after I have an intention, remind me at certain times of the day that I intended to do such and such. But then I have her, like, after an hour, ask me, it's like, did you do it? And I get a lot of pleasure out about being to think to myself or say to Alexa, yeah, I did it. Yeah, even if it's something I don't enjoy, I guess.
No, I don't think that trivializes it. And I think a lot of people get that. I always think of that as like the pleasure of checking things off the to-do list. That's my little pleasure, is you make the list, you check things off. But it sounds like you just have the Alexa version of I check that off my to-do list. I'll take a stab here at Anton's question, and maybe even reframe the answer. But one of the things that's always been fascinating to me about flow, what we know about flow, is that flow can actually help us accelerate our personal development and our goal achievement. So even like one of the big ways this comes up is a lot of people probably have heard the idea of the 20,000 hour rule. This even gets into what Aaron was talking about, how, it takes a lot of time if you're going to develop expertise in a certain skill. But some interesting research that's come out recently suggests that when you're in a flow state, you can cut down on the hours just by being in flow. But I think that even just it provides, in a sense, a sort of answer to what Anton is saying, because I think part of the reason why is because when you're in a flow state, that the flow state is so pleasurable, and because you're so absorbed in what the activity is and you're giving it your full attention, just by definition, that you are just like getting more out of the process, and then it just makes it easier to develop that skill or develop that learning. I don't know if that quite answers your question though, Anton.
Yeah, I mean that because and the reason why I was asking, or at least one reason I was asking the question, is because if you like really focus on the change aspect of personal development, and I think a lot of times when I was saying in podcasts on YouTube, they do, it's easy for me to feel overwhelmed, or just like look at the task like I don't want to do all of that. So yeah, so it's easy to focus on you. I know you can't exclusively do things that you enjoy, but I have my own firsthand experience of I think somebody was mentioning, I think it was Shane Marie was mentioning writing. I write in my own form as well. And that's something like I set certain writing goals, but writing is, Aaron said this earlier, if you enjoy what you're doing enough, it's kind of not work. So I do challenge myself because I don't always know if I can do what I'm thinking, but it's in a context that I enjoy. So I'm more willing to do it. And yeah, that makes, and also what Rogine was saying, I do have some, I've been struggling with it lately, but checking things off, I feel better when I'm able to do that. I talked with some people that said that they checked something off twice so that they can feel better. And I've done that before, but I always feel ridiculous. So I want to stop doing that. Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you. It looks like Joe has something to say about this one too.
Yeah, just really briefly to build on one of the you made a really, really important point, I think, when you're talking about how recent research and talking about this idea of like the book Range is actually, talks about this, about as far as human development is concerned, and how there's a sampling period there. You're, kind of trying different areas of disciplines. And in that process, what happens is that you're really kind of finding out where you fit. And that process also, you start to be able to build analogies and actually see things differently from different perspectives, and allows you to see things across industries and things like that as well. So while that comes back to, kind of enjoying the journey, is that yes, there is a little bit of a pain that you're going through by trying different industries, getting outside your comfort zone, but in the long run, you're kind of still, you're building the skills that you need in order to develop as a human being. So I think that that's a really, it's really a important point that you were referring to a few moments ago.
Yeah, and I think that that's an excellent addition, and I'll even build on that. That incorporating that range also helps you develop something of value that you can contribute to the world. And this again is just something else that we know about how you actually create deep meaning in your life, is to produce something that's actually of value to the world. And this is the idea of you could spend all of those hours and never become the old Italian grandma that's absolutely perfected the sauce recipe because she's done it for 70 years. But maybe you're the person who learns Italian sauce and you learn sauces in a couple different traditions. And now you're the one person who's able to kind of combine all of that knowledge into something that's new. And now you've got something unique and valuable that you can add to the world, precisely because you've maybe sampled, you've had that range, and you've able to integrate it in a new form. Did you want to add something there, John?
Yeah, I'll just add something really quickly. I mean, as well as the type of learning environments that you're in. Like most learning environments are like kind of what they're termed to be wicked, which is a word that's probably used quite a bit anymore. But versus a kind learning environment. And then where you're used to, most environments that you're going to function in are wicked. Therefore, having that kind of wide range of skill sets and things like that, you'll find that it does allow you to it brings you pleasure in the long run. Because once you find what you fit, what you identify with, and you've gone through the sampling period, that then you also have additional skills and this has been proven out like through different types of studies, athletes and all that. And anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. It looks like Shane Marie has something to add here.
No, I was just curious. You had referenced probably not being able to compete with a grandmother who makes this delicious sauce because she's doing it for 70 years, but you're a person who knows how to make many sauces per se. But what if it's the case that we're neither? How do we encourage ourselves to participate anyway when maybe there's not going to be external recognition? So how do we find ourselves willing to participate when it's just simple joy for us? And I think like it sounds like the answer is in the question. But at the same time, I think we kind of imagine that if we participate, there's some grander outcome or something along those lines that maybe prevents us from pursuing these things.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm sorry Maritza had to leave. And I know she did ultimately have to catch a flight. So I think hopefully she's safely on her way back to Philly. But I wish she were here because I think what she was saying when she was last speaking was even starting to get to your point that even perhaps the worst thing we can do is to try to pursue a goal just because we think it's something that other people want. And to your point of there is just incredible value of the joy of doing so maybe you're never going to be the grandmother that's been making the sauce for 70 years, but maybe you love Italian cooking and maybe you get your skills to the point where you make a sauce that just makes you so happy to eat this all the time and serve it to your friends and family, and that's wonderful. I mean, you were kind of saying, right, that it's kind of there in your question, that you've found the joy, and you've made your life better. And maybe if it was sauce, hopefully even, the friends and family that you get to share the meal with, by leaning into the little pleasures of life. So I think we are kind of running out of time now. So I'm just going to remind you all that there is another 52 Living Ideas meetup right after this one that starts at 9 p.m. Eastern time. So in just about 7 minutes here. This one is going to be a continuation of conversations about the Gospel of John. And it is a different link. So you'll have to sign off from this one and make sure to go back to the meetup page and find the 52 Living Ideas link for that conversation. But I just want to thank you all again for joining me and Maritza when she was here and doing this exploration of chapter 2 with us. And so we will be back 2 weeks from today, and we'll be getting into chapter 3. Chapter 3 is called The Veils of Maya, and we're going to be kind of exploring illusion versus reality. So as I said, I'm reading this book for the first time with all of you too, so I have no idea what we're up for, but I think it's going to be a really good discussion. And even when we go beyond MC, sometimes I feel like conversations like the ones we had today where we go beyond MC, I personally even get the most out of them. So thank you all, and I look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you, Joya.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.